Does Russia's war in Ukraine threaten the entire world order? And with Russia a permanent UN Security Council member, is the very credibility of the UN under threat? How does all this affect Taiwan? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Raymond Sung, Deputy CEO of think tank Taiwan New Constitution Foundation, and Peter Chase, a senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund in Brussels, who grew up in Taiwan and was seconded to the American Institute in Taiwan from 1986 to 1988. And earlier I spoke to the Czech Republic Senate Foreign Affairs, Defense and Security Committee Chair, Pavel Fischer, who ran for president in 2018 and is also on the permanent delegation of the Czech Parliament to the Interparliamentary Union. Now, the United Nations was established in the wake of World War II to ensure that never again would the world experience the needless horror and obliteration of the two world wars. Yet now, in 2022, Permanent Security Council member Russia is mobilizing for the first time since World War II after invading Ukrainian territory. And more Russian atrocities and targeting of civilians are being uncovered. Our first report. A UN-backed independent inquiry has found that war crimes were committed in Ukraine.
The Commission has visited 27 towns and settlements and has interviewed more than 150 victims and witnesses. We have inspected sites of destruction, graves, places of detention and torture. Based on the evidence gathered by the Commission, it has concluded that war crimes have been committed in Ukraine.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said the International Criminal Court had opened an investigation into Ukraine. The ICC handles war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide and crimes of aggression.
I am deeply concerned regarding the allegations and the information we are seeing regarding what appeared to be reasonable grounds to believe intentional targeting of civilian objects, and also the transfer of populations from Ukraine outside.
Despite meeting more than 20 times this year, the Council has been unable to take any meaningful action on Ukraine. Why? Because Russia is a permanent Security Council member with veto power.
The very international order that we have gathered here to uphold is being shredded before our eyes. We cannot, we will not allow President Putin to get away with it.
As a UN Security Council member, Russia is responsible for maintaining international peace and security under the UN Charter. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, in a powerful speech, called for UN reform. He said the foundations of the UN had been severely shaken, and Russia's aggressions in Ukraine were an act that tramples on the vision and principles of the UN Charter.
ご列席の皆様、安保理常任理事国であるロシアによるウクライナ侵略により、国連の信頼性が危機に陥っていることを直視しなければなりません。その信頼を回復するために、我々国連加盟国が行動しなければならない。安全保障理事会の改革に向けて、文言ベースの交渉を開始する時です。
Will the member states of the United Nations rise to Kishida's call for reform? Certainly, the costs of doing nothing are mounting. Peter Chase, now in our report we said that the Security Council has been unable to take any meaningful action against Russia in Ukraine because Russia is a Security Council member. One of the very latest resolutions was the call for Russia to leave the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, but this was vetoed by Russia and China. How much of a problem is it that there is a conflict of interest with Russia being a judge on its own war?
You know, I think you've done a very good report here, and I think it's really important to bear in mind what both Mr. Blinken and Mr. Kishida said, that the fact that a member of the UN Security Council, a permanent member, has invaded another country and is trying to annex its territory through the use of force is a deep blow to the system of international law that is embodied, that the United Nations embodies. It's a creation of international law after, as your report said, the dangers, the destruction that we had in World War II. And in a way, it's time zero, where every country decided that it was going to agree to a system of international law. But it's not the first such basis. There was also something called the League of Nations that was created after World War I that failed, in part because the League of Nations did not understand and did not accept that some great powers, that the basis of the rule of law is that the powerful submit to it. And if the powerful are going to submit to it, they're going to only do so because they have the power of, they have the right of might. And here they want to say, well, we want to subject your might to international law. They'll only do it if they have the right to veto in those extraordinary circumstances. So the way the UN Security Council was created in a pragmatic fashion, in recognition that if we're going to have a functioning rule of law, we also have to understand the importance of power. But even within that, people are calling for reform because of this. And I think that the invasion of Ukraine is making people think seriously about something that's been on the agenda for some time.
Raymond Sung, do you agree? Is there a problem with the system?
Yes, of course. I think it's interesting that Peter brought out the contrast between the United Nations and the League of Nations after the First World War. I think one of the most remarkable differences is that the primary responsibility for maintaining the peace and international security was given to the Security Council, and given the Security Council certain powers of making mandatory actions on behalf of the international community. And so that's why that it needs to have the endorsement of all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So that means that any decisions under Charter 7 of the Charter, which means that it can command every nations of the United Nations members to comply with the Security Council resolutions. For example, to build up an alliance force like in 1950s Korean War, or in the 1990s Iraq War, first Gulf War. Also, it could order ceasefire, or like the clip shows, it could establish a criminal tribunal to investigate war crimes. Those are compulsory actions given to the Security Council. But to taking the reality of power politics, it has to make some compromises to give the so-called veto powers to those 5 permanent members, and Russia is one of them. So, of course, I agree totally with Peter that the lessons from the Ukraine war give a profound lesson to the world that we should devise or rethink this arrangement.
So, Peter Chase, China is also a permanent Security Council member. Are there any situations that we could foresee where China may also have a conflict of interest in being a judge on its own actions, for example, either with Xinjiang or with Taiwan?
Of course. I mean, all 5 of the permanent members of the Security Council have the right to a veto, and they'll use it. The United States has too. But I think it's interesting to note that since 2007, I think the Russians have vetoed 26 times. The Chinese have supported them 12 times. The United States has used its veto 4. So that's since 2007, last 15 years. If you go back before that, there's more times when the United States uses it. But I think it's important that the question is, do you have this because it's the only way to get the great powers to agree that there will be limits on their power? But it's not the end of the system. I think it's really important that even though we talk about the Security Council not having done something, the UN General Assembly does do things. And in fact, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted a resolution condemning Russia, 141 countries condemning Russia, only 5 voting against that.
They also suspended Russia from the UN's human rights body.
Exactly,
right,
which is really
in April.
important. So there are things that the United Nations has been able to do to criticize Russia, to isolate Russia, and many countries who are concerned about great powers going overboard, overusing their power, including their power of veto. People want to put it in a box. And I think that there is a new resolution that's just been adopted by the UN General Assembly, put forward by one of the smallest countries, Liechtenstein, that would say that any time a permanent member of the UN current Security Council vetoes, within 10 days there must be a debate in front of the General Assembly where that Security Council member explains why it did, which is very, very important.
Yes, I believe that's a very interesting suggestion. Raymond Sung,
Yes.
do you think that Ukraine, because there have been debates about reform, obviously, for decades, but do you think Ukraine can finally give the push that's needed for reform? And what sort of reform are we talking about?
Much is dependent on the political situations, and Russia is not going to easily give up its right to veto, but the pressure is there. And also in the history, there are several proposals being raised. For example, a permanent member of the Security Council should not be able to vote on a matter which is he itself is involved. That's also pushed this time by Mexican delegations, and also
to remove the conflict of interest.
Yeah. And Ukraine's President Zelensky also argued that Russia should be deprived of its veto powers, given to that it's a flagrant violations it has done. And also the Peter just mentioned, those are the pressures to sort of kind of given the system a reshape, and telling those 5 permanent members that if you want to keep those veto powers, you have to at least to come out and explain, or to have some constraints being put on their exercise of power. Also, proposals for the reform of the Security Council also being put forward. For example, enlargement of the membership of the permanent seat of the UN Security Council, and the enlargement of the Security Council membership itself. So those are the steps. Of course, these lessons the world is now witnessing also add pressures to the successful possibility for success of those proposals.
Peter Chase, the enlargement of the the permanent UN Security Council. I understand that Russia supports India's bid and the US supports Japan's bid. If we were to have these 2 members, for example, how would this change the dynamics, do you believe?
If they were permanent Security Council members with all the rights that currently are attributed to permanent Security Council members, I think it would change the dynamics quite a lot. But I don't think it would be limited to just those 2. In the United States, the US government has itself said, why not a member from Latin America and from Africa? And again, so you're beginning to think of how representative should the Security Council be, and how do you do it better so that it is more representative?
Yes, because let's not forget that this was set up in 1945. It was a long time ago.
Correct.
And the world has changed. So.
Indeed, and so I think people are looking at that. But again, it's really important to know that even when there's a logjam in the Security Council, the rule of law that we've created still tries to bring people in. And things like saying Russia should be out of the Security Council, Russia should be out of the UN, that doesn't, then you outlaw them. And if someone is outside the law, then they can do whatever they want. So you don't want that. You want people staying within the bounds of the law. The question is, how good is the law? It's as good as it can be enforced. And so then what are the instruments of enforcement? And here, the courts that they say, but saying people rising up to criticize the use of force or the use of chemical weapons or genocide, these are the ways that are other ways that people force all of us as countries to adhere to the laws and obligations we've taken on.
Yeah, I actually wanted to pick up on something that you both mentioned. Raymond Sung, you said that, Russia would not simply give up its position or its veto power, but there must be instances, situations where it cannot just be up to what the member, the permanent security member, wants or does not want.
Right.
I mean, that is why, Peter, you mentioned that the General Assembly, the power of the General Assembly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. All those are imperfections of the international system, and I learned all those years that the international system operated on a community interest base, that everybody needs to get on board. And it's reflected in the treaty negotiations, it's reflected in the decision-making mechanism in the United Nations. But also the law is in operation. For example, a majority of states, at least in the Western camp, impose economic sanctions, severe economic sanctions on Russia, try to stop the funding or the financial support of their war machinery. And those are taking effects on the situations, and those are operating in the real world. So outside, even though it's outside United Nations. So what we talk about, one is the credibility or the sustainability of the UN machinery. And the other one is the challenges posed to international law, because Russia, although given that all the hard arguments it tried very hard to push forward, there's no substantiated, it's a violation of international law. And it's really a bottom line of how international system operates. You cannot take other states' territory by force. You cannot simply erase a nation from the map, like in the words of President Biden. So it's a flagrant violation of the international law. The problem is that states are taking actions, but those actions are not perfect, and are not enough to stop the war. But it imposes costs on those who violate international law. It cannot go on forever. It will dry out, like we see in the Russian army. So it's how the international system operates. It takes time.
Right. Peter, we will come to this idea of the territorial states and respecting these territorial borders in the second half. But let's end this section on talking about the nuclear threat. So. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said that even raising the spectre of a nuclear attack is a threat to peace and stability. How would the world respond if Putin was to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, even if it was the so-called non-strategic, the short-range tactical nuclear weapons?
I think everyone has made it extremely clear to Mr. Putin that the use of any nuclear weapons in Ukraine puts him so far beyond the pale of violating. I mean, what he's done is a flagrant, not just a flagrant violation. I mean, it's completely unacceptable. And people are trying to help and criticize Russia, help Ukraine to push them back, while trying to maintain the war within certain boundaries. We don't want this to spill out into a third world war, and there is always a danger of it. Something like the use of nuclear weapons changes the dynamic dramatically, and all you can hope is that not even Mr. Putin would be willing to go that far. This question of annexation, the sham annexations that are going on, is a serious one, because then it creates that part of Ukraine as a territory of the Russian Federation. And then what Ukraine does is an attack against the Russian Federation, which has not happened yet. Everything has been within the Ukraine right now. But everyone has said to the Russians that they're going too far to annex the country of another sovereign state, which we'll get to this next session, I think.
Yes.
So Raymond Sung, this, of course, the annexations in the 4 areas, I mean, added up together, this land would equal the same landmass as Hungary or Poland.
Yeah.
And as Peter said, it then supposedly gives Putin the excuse to use nuclear weapons to defend Russian soil?
It's very important that the basic line for the use of or threat of use of nuclear weapons is that you can store it, but it's not for you to use it. You can use to deter invasion or deter aggression, but it's not to be used to gain advantage in your battleground. That's the bottom line. So even though you can put up a sham referendum to say that formally part of Ukraine territory is now Russian, but you cannot stage so far as to bomb it with the nuclear weapons. It will affect at least European nations. It will affect the environment. It will affect everyone. And so that's why even mention of it is a threat. It's a violation of international law. And I think if that happened, God forbid, if that should happen, it will put all those involved total different game. For example, the NATO nations has been very careful so far not to be interfering or intervening of this conflict, but the use of nuclear weapon by Russia will change that. And the removal of Putin, because the world cannot tolerate a madman who can will its army and who can push the button on the nuclear weapon system just to keep its own position. It's not totally not acceptable. It's danger to everybody. So that will make the removal of Putin from office a real possibility and a real policy goal. So those are the policies behind the current threat of Putin made.
Right, okay, thank you. Now, the first NATO country to send tanks to Ukraine back in April was the Czech Republic. The country currently holds the EU presidency and is calling for the establishment of an international tribunal for war crimes after mass graves were found in Izium in Ukraine's northeast. Earlier, I spoke to Pavel Fischer, the chair of the Czech Republic's Senate Foreign Affairs, Defense and Security Committee, who told me why Taiwan must also be wary of Russia's UN breaches.
I think that if we observe how Putin created the narrative, how he distorted the international law with a blatant disrespect of internationally recognized borders, be it in Georgia or in Ukraine, we see that this blatant breach of the UN Charter by one of the members of Security Council is something extremely serious, because UN was built on the respect of borders with the ethos of preventing wars coming back. The behavior of Russia within UN in Security Council is important to follow since many years, during the Syrian conflict, for instance, or now with the Ukrainian war. Very often, Russia was backed and accompanied by China. Chinese veto was extremely often when Russia wanted to veto something. We have heard from Putin and from Xi Jinping to connect Ukraine and Taiwan in one phrase, in one message. This is something disturbing, because if Putin succeeded to breach and disrespect UN Charter, we have to be extremely cautious, because Xi Jinping can do similar breach. By the way, the lessons we have learned in Hong Kong, when he completely ignored internationally recognized status of Hong Kong, is something that we should pay maybe much more attention to than usually, and I speak about Europeans.
So you see a pattern there between the two authoritarian countries. You mentioned the Security Council. Ukraine has called for Russia to be struck off, I guess, from that Security Council. How likely would it be that Ukraine would get backing for that?
I think that in the UN status, you have a full list of conditions each of the member states subscribed to respect by coming in the organization. And I think that this organization, if it is not, and I don't want that it becomes completely without any significance, for its purpose, for its very purpose, for its survival, for its very survival, should be extremely strong in terms of addressing the breach of UN Charter. And if one of the members violating UN Charter at the same time in his capacity of member of the UN Security Council decides what is wrong and what is not wrong, there is a problem. And we have to address it. Ways exist, by the way, by UN General Assembly vote, but we are not there, unfortunately, for the time being. But we have to work much more in order to address this within the UN organization. If not, UN has no raison d'être to continue. There is no reason that UN continues as if nothing happened.
There is a possible nuclear risk at Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. The IAEA called for the second resolution to ask Russia to leave. I understand that Czech Republic suffered from the impact of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. What is the feeling in the Czech Republic about the possible impacts of another nuclear disaster?
Nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia is the largest in Europe, so it is a very important utility, and we have to be aware of the risks. By the way, Ukraine today cooperates with the European Union in energy. The grids are already connected. So by attacking Zaporizhzhia power plant or others, Putin not only put on the spot the fears connected with the nuclear accidents, but he wants to undercut the cooperation of Europe, European Union on one side, and Ukraine in energy terms on other side. So this is a very tricky game. By the way, in IAEA, in the vote of a resolution you speak about, if I am not mistaken, Russia was against, and China was also against. We see again that Russia and China operate together in order to create tensions in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, where Russian soldiers have nothing to do, but they have their armaments and weaponry. For the Czech Republic and the opinion, public opinion here, the memories of the Chernobyl disaster are still vivid for a certain generation. We live very far, but because of the wind, we were also partly exposed to the radiation. Yes, people have fear from any accident of nuclear power plant, and Russia plays with the fire. This is a psychological tool of stabilizing public opinions in democratic Europe, and we have to read it as such. Russia is not, I hope, preparing a destruction of the power plant, but does everything which is prescribed by international rules and law, and this is something that we should address again in International Criminal Court.
That was the Czech Republic Senate Foreign Affairs, Defense and Security Committee Chair, Pavel Fischer, speaking to me earlier, highlighting a pattern of voting by Russia and China as permanent Security Council members. Peter Chase, Pavel Fischer says Vladimir Putin has distorted international law. Can we talk about how he has done this, with an eye perhaps on Russia's Security Council position, but also perhaps to reflect on whether China does the same sort of thing?
Well, Mr. Fisher speaks very, very well, and his points, I think, are very important for people to bear in mind. And he reflects also not just the view of the Czech Republic, but actually most of the countries of Europe. And I think that that's important. The question about Mr. Putin distorting international law, I'd be much more blunt. He broke international law. He tries to make it so that international law is on his side, but actually no one believes him.
So what in particular does he, how, in the things that he says that he's doing, he protects himself by positioning it a certain way? For example, saying that Ukraine is actually not sovereign. Is that one of the examples?
This is where using history, and I think we'll talk about this in a while, the use of history in trying to deal with international conflicts is a very dangerous double-edged sword. So he's trying to use his own version of Russia's history and the history between Russia and Ukraine to say that these are one people. If they're one people, then what is he doing? Bombing them. I mean, his view of how he justifies what he's doing is not a question of international law, it's a question of Mr. Putin's psychology. And it's important to him. But it can be as important as he wants to him. It is not allowable under international law. And 141 countries voted in a resolution condemning the actions of the Russians and telling the Russians that they should cease all his hostilities and let UN people in to protect the civilians, because everything that's been done so far has been a straightforward violation of international law, not a distortion. He wants to tell a story. No one believes his story, except for him and perhaps a few other people.
Raymond Sung, if I can just quote from the UN Charter. So it says, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Ukraine also must enjoy sovereign equality.
Yes.
So for you, can you talk about Russia and how it's broken the law, but also perhaps reflect on China and what it has also said about Taiwan?
Okay. There are several bases that Russia raised to justify its special military operations against Ukraine. The first one is that Ukraine is not really a sovereign state. It's created together with Soviet Union, always part of Soviet Union, and that's obviously it's wrong, because the borders with Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and the independent statehood of Ukraine was agreed to in the 1990 breakup of the Soviet Union, meaning that it's part of the package deal also being agreed to by Russia Federation itself. And secondly, they said there has been genocide happened in the eastern part of Ukraine, where among the peoples speaking Russia. And that argument was successfully refuted by Ukraine's claim to the International Court of Justice, saying that Russia has failed to prove that there's no genocide. And because there's no genocide, there's no humanitarian intervention, there's no grounds for the invitation made by those shamble republics in the Donbass to invite Russians force in. And those are those successful refutation of the supposedly grounds to justify Russia's war. In terms of China, I'm glad to hear you mention pattern to Mr. Pavel Fisher, because there's also a pattern of breaking international law on part of China. First is the South China Sea, when the UN 1982 Convention on Law of the Sea agreed that each state's entitlement to the maritime spaces must be measured from their coast, not from the other bases like lines in the middle, they call the 9-dash line by China, which is an Asian claim, but that was replaced by the 1982 convention. And also in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is still, the handover of Hong Kong from United Kingdom to China was done under the 1984 joint declaration, which is an international treaty, and the terms and the conditions, especially high degree of autonomy guaranteed by that international treaty, which means that agreed by China itself, was done in black paper, black and white, and this cannot be removed and take away from Hong Kong people.
Raymond Sung, do you, Pavel Fischer, raise that, the issue that China could behave in the same way,
yes.
and you're saying that they are behaving in the same way as Russia, and that the world didn't respond adequately on Hong Kong. Do you agree?
Yes, but it's also on the other side of it, it's very difficult for what the world can do. The human rights, for example, UN human rights machinery has done its bit, saying that the people on the street are exercising their rights under the International Convention about their civil liberties. And it's not that the police, Hong Kong police has stepped out of its boundaries to the legitimate use of police force, which are the international condemnation, and it's very loud and clear. But it's very difficult for the international society to put on a feasible restraint on the exercise of power by Hong Kong government and also by Chinese government, except for condemnation. But the condemnation also carries power in the case of Hong Kong, in the case of Xinjiang.
Peter Chase.
Can I follow up very quickly?
Sure.
I think it's important to say that China's behavior in Hong Kong is completely unacceptable, but where the international community went wrong with respect to Russia and Ukraine was not responding more forcefully to Georgia, what they did in Georgia,
And how about
and in 2014 in the Crimea. That's where we went wrong rather than Hong Kong. Hong Kong is different because Hong Kong, under international law, Hong Kong, and under the agreement that we're talking about, Hong Kong is a part of China. It's a special autonomous region of China, which gave it certain rights and privileges that the Hong Kong people felt were allowed them something different than what China was trying to impose. So it's, quote, more and more of an internal matter rather than a matter of international law. So it's more difficult, I think, in that case, for the international community to intervene, whereas on something like Crimea and Georgia, there's no question that what was being done was illegal.
So just add one word. So that's why the Hong Kong people are asking that we are asking for our autonomy. We are not asking sovereignty or any intervention of international society. So that's why. Yeah.
Peter Chase, Pavel Fischer says that the UN is not there yet. And we have also spoke about, that it needs time. However, will it be too late by the time we get there?
Will it be too late to reform and strengthen the UN?
And to try to put pressure, or all the mechanisms that, essentially how the UN works?
Yeah, I think it's important to bear in mind that it's not just the UN. Raymond mentioned earlier this use of people adopting sanctions to respond to Russia's action. And I think that those are, quote, not UN instruments, but they are multilateral instruments where people are trying to tell a member of the international community that what they're doing is unacceptable and has consequences. And that's a way to enforce the international law, and it's something that's very important that they're doing that.
Or the multilateral system as a whole.
But in the beginning of this, we talked about whether or not Russia's invasion of Ukraine will push reform in the UN system. Actually, COVID started even more the need to reform the UN system, and people were looking at that.
Because of the WHO.
Because of the WHO, because of the lack of people's engagement in a consistent and coherent way to address a global threat. There was a report that was done by the UN Secretary General last year in September called The Common Agenda, which pointed for UN reform. And next year, there will be a special summit on the future of the UN, a summit on the future of the UN, where there is an active process where people are looking at this. There's been a high-level advisory board about effective multilateralism, which is trying to say, how do we bring all these tools together, again, to make sure that people don't use their power outside the court of international law.
Right.
Raymond.
Right, it's a difficult, very profound question. It's how the international community deal with outlandish outsiders or violations. And it's difficult because there's two ways of thinking that in the post-Cold War era that the international cooperation should take step in and the international community to exercise, for example, the responsibility to protect, for example, to bear more responsibility for what happens in internal to other countries, because there are impacts. For example, in the Middle East crisis, we see large flows of migrants and refugees. It did has terrible humanitarian costs and impact to neighboring countries. So the international community should bear more responsibility to respond to that. But there's also difficulties in this area of economic situation and shortage, and each country is taking care of its own business. It's difficult for them to take more on their part. So it's really question is about how we realistically respond to international crisis, also including not only human security like refugee, also climate change.
Okay, thank you. Now, removing a Security Council member has just one precedent. That was the removal of Taiwan, or the Republic of China, in 1971. This year marks the 51st anniversary of Taiwan's expulsion from the United Nations, when Communist China took Taiwan's seat. Ken Ning reports.
In 1945, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Taiwan, under its official name, the Republic of China, was one of 5 founding members of the United Nations. But in 1971, the ROC was expelled from the UN and replaced by the People's Republic of China as the rightful one China on the UN Security Council.
As everybody knows by now, last Monday, late into the night, I mean, the United States lost the fight to keep nationalist China in the United Nations. And the Albanian resolution to admit communist China to the UN was passed, and Taiwan was sort of booted out.
Today, authoritarian China is a permanent UN Security Council member with veto rights, while democratic Taiwan is locked out of dozens of international bodies and summits. Despite its world-class public health system, Taiwan is barred from the WHO. Despite 48 million passengers flights a year before the pandemic, Taiwan is banned from the ICAO. However, it is a member of the WTO under the name Separate Customs Territory of Taiwan, Penghu, Jinmen, and Mazu, or Chinese Taipei. This is the same name Taiwan must use to compete in global sporting events under the International Olympics Committee, all of this under pressure from Beijing to reduce and isolate Taiwan. This pressure extends to Taiwan's representative offices, which must use Taipei to reduce the nation's statehood. Last year, Lithuania allowed a representative office under the name Taiwanese. Vilnius is still suffering the economic coercion and export controls leveled by the PRC. For decades, Taiwan has launched campaigns to join the UN General Assembly and the World Health Assembly, even as observers. Taiwan was only allowed to join the WHO as an observer between 2009 and 2016 under former President Ma Ying-jeou, who agreed there was one China but disagreed on who was running it. Taiwan's argument to join the international community is that the UN's sacred commitment of leaving no one behind shouldn't neglect the 23 million people of Taiwan.
That report by Ken Ning about how Taiwan was ejected from the United Nations by China in 1971. Raymond Sung, so there has been a precedent for removing a Security Council member. It happens to be Taiwan. Yes. How difficult was it for the PRC to raise 2758?
All right. Ever since its establishment in 1949, the PRC government wanted to represent China and take over the seat in the United Nations, including the seat in the Security Council. But 2758 was a resolution passed by the General Assembly, and it's about the membership. It's about who represents China in the United Nations. And so it's not strictly accurate to say that it's about Taiwan. It's really about the then regime governing Taiwan, which called itself the Republic of China and claimed itself to be the continuation of the government which governs China before 1949, and argue for the right to represent China and occupy the UN seat. And that was supported by the America. And so the case in point is clear evidence the pull of reality, because a government who really governs Taiwan, Penghu, Jinmen, and Mazu cannot claim to represent China. There's so many incidences of inconsistencies happening in those years. For example, in Olympics, when the Taipei government wants to use the team name of China, but the China refused to accept other name than China to participate in the Olympics. So there are two Chinas, and the World Olympic Committee really made the decision early in 1958, saying that, well, we know which one is the real China, which is the Beijing government. Taiwan, you should call itself Taiwan, and Formosa. And it's earlier as that. So it's out of the pool of reality.
And at that time, did Taiwan consider being called Formosa?
And that's happened in 1960, Rome Olympic, 64, 68. Taiwan, under the Chiang Kai-shek government, refused to use the name Taiwan. So it's a historical irony. But it shows the pool of reality, because unsubstantiated claims cannot last forever. It cannot, for an ROC, Chiang Kai-shek government, claiming to represent the whole China. It's simply not true. It will counter countless problems, and the international community will come to the real senses. In 2758, it says it restores PRC's legitimate rights to represent the whole China.
Peter Chase, so if I could go down to quote the actual words. So as Raymond Sung said, the PRC are the only lawful representatives of China to the United Nations, but expelled forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek. Taiwan's government very recently reminded the PRC again that Resolution 2758 doesn't refer to Taiwan, it refers to representatives of Chiang Kai-shek. So is this a loophole that Taiwan should be pushing more, exploiting more, or at least Taiwan's government?
Well, first, I think it's important to reinforce what Raymond said at the beginning of his comments just now, that it's not that there was a member of the Security Council removed, but who represented that member, the member was China, who represented that member was changed from one government to another, from the Chiang Kai-shek government to the government in Beijing. I mentioned earlier that it's very important to be careful about how you use history in arguing how international law should go. And this was a perfect example, or this is a perfect example, in the sense that for a long period of time, there was an agreement on both sides of the strait that there was one China. And that's changing, and it's changing with the realities that Raymond pointed out to. It's not real that there's one China and that one government here rules all of China and one government in Beijing rules all of Taiwan. That's not true. But how you change it is very important. And the question that you just pointed to, I think, is very significant in the sense that in the Taiwan Policy Act, something that's being discussed now in the US Congress, and I think we'll get to it, there is some allusion to this and some clarification, and also kind of saying, that resolution itself does not say anything about Taiwan. But it's also important to bear in mind that if people had not recognized, and there was a danger that they might not recognize, the Chiang Kai-shek government as the consistent government of China in 1949, 1950, what might have happened to Taiwan? So I think we're trying now to say, how do we move international law? What happened in 1949, that China and Taiwan was the continuation, is a good thing. Now we're trying to say, how do we move international law to catch up with what seems to have happened since.
Raymond, so Taiwan Policy Act, yes, it does, as Peter said, seek to clarify Resolution 2758. Let me quote,
yes.
it did not address the issue of representation of Taiwan and its people in the UN, did not take a position on the relationship between the PRC and Taiwan, or include any statement pertaining to Taiwan's sovereignty. And the Act also has a provision to promote Taiwan's inclusion,
Yes.
In international organizations. So, and this has been singled out by Taiwanese lawmakers as one of the most important aspects of this act.
Yes.
Sorry.
Those three sentences are extremely important. Firstly, to make clear that it has the U.S. Governmental position, at least parliamentary support, saying that UN's Resolution 2758 is not about Taiwan. It's about which government represents China, and it leaves a loophole on Taiwan's position in the UN, which is not resolved yet. And it doesn't say anything about the relationship between Taiwan and China. It doesn't say that Taiwan is part of China, which has a precedent before Taiwan Policy Act. In 2007, the Taiwanese government submitted its accession to a human rights treaty to UN Secretary General. But the Secretary General rejected that accession. And in their letter to the member state, it addresses that the Resolution 2758 has addressed that as far as the UN is concerned, Taiwan has been an integral part of the PRC, which is refuted by United States, New Zealand, and Australia, other Canadian governments, saying that's not the position as far as we are concerned, what the resolution says. It doesn't say anything about that Taiwan is part of China. And they asked the Secretary General to refrain from using that kind of formation, which has been observed until today. So it's very clear, it's very important to make clear that Resolution 2758 is not about Taiwan's representation in the UN. That issue is still a gap, it's still an issue that has to be resolved to fill the gap for the international community.
Peter Chase, what difference can the Taiwan Policy Act, if passed, if this element is passed, what difference can it make for Taiwan in the UN?
Well, the Taiwan Policy Act, if I recall correctly, has been voted out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's not yet been adopted by the Senate or by both houses of Congress, and it's not been signed into law by it. But it is a very strong statement because it came out with very strong bipartisan support in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And it's a very strong statement among very important people in US politics about to leave places open for Taiwan, to support Taiwan against the potential of the Chinese overdoing it and trying to push Taiwan and trying to push reunification in a way that goes contrary to the Taiwan Relations Act. Because the Taiwan Relations Act is still there. The Taiwan Policy Act reaffirms it. We still believe that this is an issue that needs to be resolved peacefully between the governments in Beijing and in Taipei. And I think that it's not yet a signal that we've, quote, ended strategic ambiguity altogether, which is the long-standing US policy towards Taiwan and China, basically because we're trying to say to both sides, do this right, do it properly, do it without conflict, which means that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, diplomatic work that needs to be done, not just bilaterally, but internationally. And Taiwan convincing people, convincing countries that the 2758 does not actually say anything about the status of Taiwan per se, is an important part of a diplomatic engagement of how you set the stage for acceptance under international law of something different than what people, than what is currently the interpretation of Taiwan's status.
Raymond Sung, I want to move to our final question, and it adds to what Peter was saying. China's been ramping up the threats to reunify with Taiwan. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said, we quote, "Any move to obstruct China's reunification is bound to be crushed by the wheels of history." China's Taiwan Affairs Office said the motherland must be reunified and will inevitably be reunified. All of this, of course, Taiwan rejects. What basis does the PRC have for these claims that Taiwan is part of its territory?
China has its own basis. It used to be stick to by both PRC government and the ROC government before democratization of Taiwan, which is different. Nowadays we refer to Republic of China, Taiwan. It's different from the Republic of China in 1912, which is very important. I think the president of Taiwan made that clear. Their basic basis is that in 1943, coming to the end of the Second World War, the three governments had China, Great Britain, and America agreed in Cairo to say that Taiwan, Formosa, and its islands should be returned to China, which is not.
But it's not a
treaty.
No, it's not a treaty.
Only a press release in the newspaper. It's not signed. It's not registered or anything. That's an expression of intention. But things change after 1945, extremely, especially out of Korean War and the Chinese Civil War. What is important following on.
Sorry, maybe can I just interject there that even if Taiwan had been returned, which, as we said, is not a legal document, that would have been returned to the Republic of China.
There is a
be the
deep
PRC.
irony, I must say, if I may, in this incident. PRC has always been very firm to reject any legitimacy